Hey everyone, we've drifted past witches, and we've tiptoed through the chambers of frail royal children. Tonight, let's ease into a slightly lighter, though no less ridiculous, corner of history. Because for every tragic child king who coughed his way to the throne, there was also a monarch who lived long, healthy, and absolutely determined to waste their time on petty grievances. Kings and queens with absolute power, and the emotional maturity of a squabbling toddler. And really, what could be more soothing than tucking ourselves in and listening to stories of history's pettiest monarchs? Let's settle in. We might as well start with King Louis XIV of France. Known as the Sun King. Builder of Versailles. Center of European fashion and power. He controlled one of the most glorious courts in history. And yet, he held grudges so small they would embarrass a cranky neighbor with a noisy lawnmower. Louis XIV insisted that his courtiers follow elaborate rules of etiquette. Not because he cared about manners, he didn't, but because he enjoyed humiliating them. For example, there was the ritual of the lever, his morning wake-up ceremony. Nobles literally competed for the privilege of handing him his socks. Not his crown. Not his sword. His socks. He would occasionally grant or deny people the right to sit on a stool in his presence. A stool. Imagine spending 20 years fighting in wars, clawing your way up the ladder of power, only for the king to tell you whether your rear end was allowed to touch furniture. Louis found this endlessly satisfying. And of course, when his courtiers failed to follow his intricate dress codes, he publicly mocked them. This is a man who ruled over the most powerful kingdom in Europe, and yet his main joy in life was fashion policing. Let's drift over to England for a moment. To King Henry VIII. Petty is perhaps not the first word people use for Henry. Tyrannical, gluttonous, casually murderous tend to come first. But beneath all that, yes, he was remarkably petty. Take his treatment of Anne of Cleves. She was his fourth wife, married to him for all of 6 months. Henry met her once, declared she was too unattractive, and then spent the rest of their marriage sulking about it. He complained endlessly that he had been tricked into marrying her. He even gave her the nickname, the Flanders Mare, which, as insults go, is not only cruel but oddly specific. And, to her credit, quietly agreed to the annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and went on to live peacefully. Meanwhile, Henry, who had gotten exactly what he wanted, still couldn't let go of the petty insult of her face not matching his expectations. He was the most powerful man in England, and he spent his energy bad-mouthing his ex-wife's bone structure. Moving back to France, we find Queen Catherine de Medici, who could win Olympic medals for pettiness if such an event existed. Catherine was the Italian-born queen consort of Henry II of France, and later the power behind the throne for her sons. She despised her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Which was awkward, because Diane was 20 years older than Henry and basically raised him, making her less mistress and more glamorous mother substitute. Catherine couldn't get rid of Diane while Henry was alive, but the moment he died in a jousting accident, Catherine swooped in with the precision of a cat seizing a fallen crumb. She immediately banished Diane from court, confiscated her chateau, and stripped her of her jewels. But she wasn't finished. Catherine then made sure Diane was buried in a modest grave, instead of the lavish resting place Diane had prepared for herself. Centuries later, when Diane's remains were rediscovered, they showed signs of having been tampered with. Catherine, it seems, had gone the extra mile to make sure her rival suffered even in death. Petty? Yes. Impressive in its thoroughness? Also yes. Let's drift north, to Scandinavia. To Queen Christina of Sweden. Christina was eccentric in many ways. She collected books, dressed in men's clothing, and refused to marry. But she also had a flair for petty grand gestures. One famous example was her abdication. In 1654, she gathered her court, dressed in her regal robes, and then dramatically stripped off her crown, her cloak, and even her gloves in front of everyone, declaring she was done. She then refused to hand over the throne's royal keys, just to prolong the moment. Christina moved to Rome, where she spent years stirring up petty feuds with artists, scholars, and the Pope himself. At one point, she even staged a fake duel between her lovers to see which of them was more devoted. The winner, naturally, was rewarded with her cold indifference. Because of course he was. And then we have Emperor Justinian II of Byzantium, nicknamed the Slit-Nosed. This was not a metaphor. His enemies literally cut off his nose during a revolt and exiled him. Most people would take the hint and retire from politics. Justinian, however, spent years plotting his return, eventually storming back into Constantinople with a prosthetic gold nose strapped to his face. When he regained the throne, he devoted his reign not to rebuilding the empire, not to reforming laws, but to hunting down every single person who had wronged him. His punishments were cruel, disproportionate, and usually fatal. He was less a ruler and more a medieval Yelp reviewer, leaving one-star ratings for anyone who crossed him. His obsession with petty revenge consumed so much of his rule that eventually he was overthrown again, this time for good. But for a brief, golden-nosed moment, he was the pettiest emperor alive. Of course, pettiness wasn't limited to kings. Let's take a soft stroll over to Russia and visit Catherine the Great. Famous for her intellect, reforms, and supposed escapades with furniture, though that last part is pure slander. Catherine had genuine power, but she also had a spectacularly petty streak. When she overthrew her husband, Peter III, she had him quietly strangled. Which is already dramatic. But then, to really drive the point home, she made sure all of Peter's portraits were removed from palaces and replaced with her own. Imagine redecorating your house just to erase your spouse's face from the wallpaper. Later, when critics mocked her for taking lovers, she commissioned flattering portraits of herself surrounded by classical goddesses, just to remind everyone that she was above their judgment. Her version of a subtweet, except carved in marble and visible to all of St. Petersburg. And then we reach one of my favorites, Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. Charles spent much of his reign convinced he was made of glass. He wore reinforced clothing so that if someone bumped into him, he wouldn't shatter. Which is more sad than petty. But his actual acts of governance? Those were pettiness incarnate. Charles once banned his brother from wearing certain colors of clothing, simply because he thought they looked better on himself. He exiled courtiers for minor slights. He declared random towns out of favor with the crown because they didn't throw large enough parades in his honor. Imagine ruling a kingdom and holding a centuries-long grudge because one village's confetti budget was too small. Finally, let's drift over to the Habsburgs one last time, because no list of dysfunctional monarchs is complete without them. Maria Theresa of Austria, despite being intelligent and politically savvy, was notoriously petty with her own children. She micromanaged their marriages, insulted their spouses, and criticized them endlessly. Her daughter Marie Antoinette, before being shipped off to France, received a long lecture from Maria Theresa about her posture, her handwriting, and her lack of seriousness. Which, to be fair, may have been accurate. But still, petty. And so, as we drift through these royal temper tantrums, we see a pattern. Absolute power did not make monarchs dignified. It made them petty in new and creative ways. They had entire kingdoms to manage, but instead spent their time fussing over stools, fashion choices, and whether their portraits looked flattering enough. The irony, of course, is that their pettiness often had real consequences. Wars were fought, fortunes ruined, dynasties altered, all because a king wanted his socks handed to him in a particular order, or a queen didn't like her husband's mistress's jewelry collection. History, it seems, is often just the story of very powerful people being exquisitely small. And with that thought, we can let the royal squabbles fade into the quiet of the night. Let their pettiness drift away like smoke from a candle. We'll pick up another thread of history in the next part, as the past continues to wander softly beside us.